It's been quite a while since we did a podcast on the channel, isn't it? The last horror game discussion we had was quite a while back for Remothered Broken Porcelain. So we're going to do another one. Now, just so you know, there's not going to be any editing outside of removing pauses or breathing. I apologize if there are any noises you don't like that aren't filtered out. But I really just feel like this sort of podcasting should just be this. Me talking into the mic and not doing heavy editing like I do for my reviews. So, The Suicide of Rachel Foster, I streamed the whole game last week and I've been thinking so hard on it. The lore, the characters, backgrounds, theories, speculation. And I love doing this sort of thing for any kind of ghost or supernatural story. Doesn't matter if it's a book, doesn't matter if it's a movie, a game, whatever it is. But before we dive in, spoilers, obviously. We're going to go into all of the spoilers for The Suicide of Rachel Foster, so if you haven't played the game and care about spoilers, what are you doing here? Get out now. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go over a basic synopsis of the game's plot. We're going to go over the quote-unquote truth, what actually happened in the past between Nicole and Rachel that we find out late in the game, and then we're going to go into a few theories. One that is definitely not true that I wanted to be true as I played the game, and a few other ones that I've thought about and found online. Without further ado, let's start with Part 1, the story synopsis. The Suicide of Rachel Foster is a story about Nicole and Rachel. We're shown right away that Nicole's father, Leonard, had an affair with a young girl named Rachel Foster. A young girl that commits suicide while 9 weeks pregnant not long after. Once this happens, Nicole and her mother immediately leave the hotel they were living in, leaving her father there, and basically not going back for almost a decade. The game starts out with you reading letters from your mom. She's about to die and on her deathbed, telling you to sell the old hotel and give all of the money that you don't need, or that Nicole doesn't need, to the girl's family, seemingly out of pity. Now, the game mostly focuses on mystery and the skepticism of whether Rachel actually killed herself and some weird stuff that goes on in the hotel while Nicole is trapped there. This mystery unravels as you go, with Irving being there to support you on the phone and seems to know a ton about the house from the get-go. The weird phone call with someone telling you not to sell the hotel, claiming that Rachel is still there. And Nicole thought right away that this phone call was suggesting that Rachel was still alive, but I thought it was pretty obvious they were more referring to her presence or her spirit. Now all of this slowly builds up with Nicole remembering stuff, going all over the papers and research, trying to figure out what actually happened. And by the end of the game, we find out that Irving is actually Rachel's little brother, torn over her death, and he fabricated a lot of stuff going on in the hotel to point Nicole in the right direction, like the old lipstick, the weird phone call, preventing others from contacting the hotel, etc., etc. He even goes as far as saying that Nicole's father thought that Rachel's spirit was lingering around the hotel, and only Nicole would be able to solve the mystery. And that's really just the story synopsis. Let's now go into the truth about what happened. To do that, we have to go back to the beginning. Nicole and Rachel were sort of rivals in childhood. Nicole was extremely jealous of how seemingly perfect Rachel was. She had an amazing ear for music, she was always prettied up and looked amazing in dresses for parties. She was pushed for perfection by her church father figure, and in Nicole's eyes, Rachel was everything that she wasn't. Going a little further into Rachel's situation, she was a high school student who was dyslexic, a learning disorder that causes issues with being able to read. Nicole actually details this when you're in the church, going on about her mom telling her how Rachel had such a good ear for music and was so talented even though she couldn't read. Now, the big thing to remember about this part of the game is Suicide of Rachel Foster takes place in the early 90s, and these flashback sequences when they were kids were in the mid-80s. Dyslexia wasn't treated the same way back then as it is today. Schools nowadays are far more aware and accommodating for learning disorders, but back then, it was more or less just used to say that someone was less intelligent, stupid. This is shown really well when you get to that hidden bedroom made for Rachel with the word retard on the chalkboard. Irving also sheds light on Rachel being a seemingly perfectly put together girl on the outside but torn apart on the inside. He mentions constant nights of Rachel putting on a strong act for him as his big sis, but could hear her breaking down and crying in her bedroom every night for how she was treated. Essentially, she was constantly called a retard at school because of being dyslexic. Now, this probably led to a lot of self-confidence issues, and I think that's why she fell for Nicole's father so easily despite the massive age gap. The story details Leonard as being roughly 30 years older than Rachel. The age of consent in Montana is 16, which is what Rachel was, and that puts Leonard at around 46 at the bare minimum. I think it's likely that Leonard, being the astrophysicist and open-minded person he is likely one of the only people in Rachel's life that didn't either view her as inferior from dyslexia or having a sheer amount of jealousy towards her like Nicole did. Now, I'm not saying that Leonard and Rachel's love wasn't genuine. The game is a bit ambiguous on what kind of man Leonard was and even what their relationship entailed. We're not explicitly told whether or not Leonard was the father of Rachel's unborn child or if they just had a different loving relationship. One would think with the age gap that he was just this old guy taking advantage of a high school kid with low self-esteem, though Irving seemed to think it was more than that when he tells Nicole about their relationship. The fixation Rachel has with him also leans me towards the low self-esteem route with how obsessed she was with him. The dream sequence we get about halfway through the game shows an alleged talk between Rachel and Leonard. Rachel constantly calling her daddy and talking about how much she missed him, and practically begging him to just tell her that he loves her again. Now, this is speculation, but we find a room in the basement's hidden chamber that is clearly a bedroom for Rachel. My theory is that Leonard actually wanted Rachel to move in with him, Nicole, and Claire, Nicole's mother. The hidden nature does feel like he wanted to hide it, and the creepy furniture drawn on the walls may have come after, but there was a bed and some furniture that clearly looks like it was created for Rachel. But then the big thing happened. Rachel didn't commit suicide. During a big party before Nicole's big hockey game, Rachel was killed with Nicole's hockey stick. The game seems to assume and tell us that Claire killed her, washed the stick after dumping her body into their car, and took a break at Nicole's hockey game to throw Rachel's body off a cliff. It's also suggested that this is what the argument was about that night between Claire and Leonard and why Claire took Nicole and left, not coming back for 9 years. It also gives motive for why Claire wanted to give the money for the hotel to Rachel's family, likely out of guilt for having killed Rachel those years ago, essentially admitting her sins while on her deathbed. Now, there are some holes in this tale, and that leads us to theory number 1. Claire wasn't supposed to be the killer. Over the course of the game, Irving and Rachel's spirit guide Nicole to the truth. The orb of light leading to the room where the ghost hunters were, and even the butterfly that led to the secret bedroom/shrine was likely a manifestation of Rachel's spirit. It might have also been Rachel that caused Nicole to sleepwalk to the church late in the game, maybe an early hint of possession. Now, this isn't a problem, as a spirit trying to guide someone to essentially show them how they died totally makes sense. But later on, it doesn't. It feels more like Rachel has personal animosity towards Nicole. The aggressive doors opening and shutting towards the end, Rachel being heard writing the word murderer to Nicole on the chalkboard up in the attic, and the ending. The finale of the game has Nicole locked in her car with Rachel's retainer in her hand, a pipe hooked to the exhaust into the window, and everything sealed shut. Essentially, Nicole is spouting nonsense, pretending or thinking that she's a kid again talking to her parents, as she is forced to turn the car on and commit suicide. Now, this could be Nicole's mental health completely breaking down after finding out her father had a hidden room for a dead girl and her mother murdered Rachel and made her ride in a car, not even knowing that Rachel's dead body was a few feet away from her. But the fact that she had a retainer in her hand, and in the previous scene she hears footsteps when she's freaking out asking if that's Rachel, it's more likely and alluded to that Rachel took possession of Nicole's body and was trying to force her to kill herself. And that begs the question, why kill Nicole after she learned the truth? One argument could be sins of the father, or in this case, sins of the mother. Claire is dead, so Rachel, as a vengeful spirit, goes after Nicole after making her remember everything. But that's not what I think. I think the original story was that it wasn't actually Claire that killed Rachel. I think in an earlier draft, Nicole was the one that killed Rachel. The jealousy overtook her and she went nuts to remove Rachel from her life. That would make more sense with why Rachel wrote murderer on the chalkboard towards Nicole and possessed her with the intention of killing her. If Claire was the one that killed Rachel, what's the point in calling Nicole the murderer? I think they probably changed the story up later on to possibly make the protagonist look like less of a bad person and more of a victim, especially with how much we see Nicole's calm and collected demeanor falling apart in the last hour of the game. Could have also been to hammer home the potency of what the player goes through when you are forced to turn that car on. But I've got 3 more theories I want to talk about. Theory number 2, illegitimate child. It's possible, and some people think that Leonard actually had an affair with Rachel's mother and that Rachel herself was his illegitimate daughter. This is mostly based on the dream sequence with her constantly telling her daddy, and Irving telling Nicole late in the game that Leonard had room in his heart for both Rachel and Nicole. The fact that it wasn't Claire and Nicole makes it sound like a daughterly love instead of love between lovers. I think there's more evidence in the slideshow we get towards the end of the game where Leonard refers to Nicole as his favorite daughter, not just his daughter. We're never really given any indication that Nicole has any brothers or sisters. And some people are kind of on, well, if Leonard was willing to have an affair with a little kid, what's stopping him from having an affair with that little kid's mother 16, 17 years prior? That is a bit reaching, but there's some crazy, creepy evidence there to support it. The next theory is something I don't really like. Theory number, mold hallucinations. Some people think that Nicole was literally just around so much mold in that hotel that she hallucinated the entire game. The changes to the area, orbs of light, butterfly, and even the attempted suicide was basically just being around mold and hallucinating so much that she had gone crazy. Now, I don't like this because it completely takes away the supernatural element. But in all reality, it is possible to hallucinate from powerful molds, so there is some possibility in this theory. Now let's talk about the final theory that was technically proven wrong by the game. This is something that I was thinking the entire time I was playing through the game on stream. I never mentioned it to you guys, but from the moment I saw the newspaper clippings in the fact that every cinematic never once let us see Nicole's face, I had it in my head that there was going to be a really big twist towards the end where we find out that we're not actually playing as Nicole, but we're playing as Rachel Foster. Maybe she had amnesia. Maybe some trauma happened way back in the day. Maybe the suicide was a cover-up for something else that happened. But I was convinced that there was going to be a mirror shot towards the end where we realize that the protagonist has the same face as Rachel Foster on those missing flyers. I'm actually a little sad that that isn't what happened. And I think I've talked your ear off enough for one day. This was a fun podcast to make. I was thinking about this the entire time with making the review and just the days following me beating that game. I hope you enjoyed this. What are your theories? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, I'll be back soon with another review.